Snowstorms are nothing new in Alaska, especially for those of us who've lived here long enough to adapt. I've spent the last 7 years in this small cabin at the edge of the woods, nestled far enough from the main town to enjoy solitude but close enough to make errands manageable. My name is Daniel, and in January 2018, one particular storm changed everything I thought I knew about winter nights. That Friday evening, I shut down my woodworking shop earlier than usual to let my staff head home before the roads became impassable. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the snow was falling thick and fast, piling into uneven drifts. After clearing just enough to park, I trudged inside, locking the door behind me, and switched on the heater. The wind howled, shaking the windows intermittently, but I found the sound oddly soothing. It was shaping up to be a quiet evening, just me, my hot coffee, and a documentary on polar expeditions playing on my small TV. Around midnight, as I leaned back in my creaky armchair, the first knock came. It was faint but distinct enough to make me sit upright and pause the show. Living this far out, with the nearest neighbor almost half a mile away, an unexpected visitor at that hour was a rarity. I approached the window cautiously, pulling aside the curtain to peer out. Heavy snow blurred the view under the weak glow of my porch light, but something caught my eye: boot prints. They were fresh, the sharp edges of each tread still visible, leading up to the front door and then back down the steps. My chest tightened. Whoever had been there hadn't lingered. They were gone, swallowed by the swirling snow. I hesitated with my hand hovering over the deadbolt. Opening the door wasn't an option. The frigid wind would have blasted snow straight inside. Still, something about those tracks didn't sit right. Trying to dismiss it as a lost hiker, I locked the door again and returned to my chair, though the unease in my gut lingered. Barely an hour later, another knock startled me, this time from the side of the house near the kitchen window. My pulse quickened as I grabbed the flashlight I kept by the door and headed to investigate. The kitchen window was frosted over, making it impossible to see outside clearly. I flicked off the interior lights to reduce the glare and aimed my flashlight into the snowy darkness. Nothing. The pristine snow outside the window remained untouched, no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. Yet I was certain the knock hadn't been my imagination. I stood there for several minutes, scanning the yard, waiting for some movement or sign of life. When nothing happened, I convinced myself it was a loose branch brushing against the siding or perhaps the storm playing tricks with the acoustics. Still, I went around double-checking every window and door, ensuring they were locked before heading to bed, leaving the flashlight on the nightstand. The third knock came louder and more insistent, jarring me awake around 3 a.m. It came from the back of the house near the sliding glass door that led to the deck. My stomach churned as I sat up, trying to steady my breathing over the sound of the relentless wind. Sliding out of bed, I grabbed the flashlight and crept down the hallway. The curtain over the sliding door wasn't drawn, leaving an unobstructed view of the snow-covered deck. From several feet away, I paused, hard hammering, and aimed the beam of light outside. The deck was empty. No footprints marred the undisturbed snow. Yet the knock had been unmistakable, 3 sharp raps, clear as day. I stared out into the swirling storm for what felt like an eternity, my eyes scanning the faint outlines of the surrounding woods. What followed was a night of relentless torment. The knocks continued, unpredictable in volume and location. They moved around the house, front door, side windows, back door, almost as if whoever was outside was circling, testing for a way in. At one point, I thought I heard faint crunching footsteps in the snow, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. The storm was too intense to even consider venturing outside, and even if I could, what would I do? Chase invisible knocks through a blizzard? The feeling of being trapped, vulnerable, with no explanation for what was happening, was unbearable. I sat on the couch, flashlight in hand, every light in the house blazing, counting down the hours until sunrise. When morning finally came, the storm had eased, leaving a stillness that felt almost mocking. Bundled in my thick coat and boots, I stepped outside to survey the property. At first, the yard seemed normal, just deep drifts of snow and the muffled quiet of the woods. But as I walked the perimeter, I began to notice the tracks. Boot prints, crisp and deliberate, circled the entire house, weaving between windows and doors. They weren't random. Whoever had made them had systematically walked the perimeter, stopping at every entrance, every pane of glass. My skin prickled as I followed the trail to the edge of the woods. There, the boot prints merged with something larger, tire tracks. A snowmobile had been waiting just beyond the tree line. The faint tracks, partially filled in by the night's snowfall, stretched into the distance, disappearing into the dense forest. I crouched down, staring at the evidence, trying to process what it meant. Someone had planned this. They braved a blizzard, circled my house repeatedly, and left just before dawn, knowing the fresh snowfall would obscure their escape. The realization was as chilling as the storm itself. This wasn't a random prank or someone seeking shelter. This was calculated. I returned to the house and called the local police. 2 officers arrived about an hour later, their expressions growing serious as I explained what had happened. The younger officers suggested it might have been teenagers messing around, but the older one dismissed the idea outright. "Not many kids out in weather like this," he muttered, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line. They followed the tracks into the woods, but returned within 15 minutes, the trail too faint to pursue. Whoever it was, the older officer said, they knew what they were doing. That word, knew, stuck with me. This wasn't random. It was deliberate, targeted. After the officers left, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints circling my home, the snowmobile lying in wait. The unease settled over me like a second skin, a constant reminder that someone had been watching, testing, planning. By afternoon, I made a decision. I drove to the nearest gun store, 30 miles away, and left with a 9mm handgun, a hunting rifle, and enough ammunition to feel prepared for anything. The clerk gave me a crash course in firearm safety, his parting advice lingering long after I left: "Don't go looking for trouble, but make sure you're ready if it finds you." That night marked a turning point. I wasn't going to let fear control me. I installed motion-activated floodlights, reinforced the locks, and kept the handgun within reach at all times. Living in solitude had always been my sanctuary, my escape from the chaos of the world. But now, it came with a sobering reality: safety isn't guaranteed, and the woods, once a source of peace, could just as easily harbor unseen dangers. Even now, every winter storm brings it all rushing back: the knocks, the tracks, the suffocating feeling of being watched. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted, they haven't returned. But if they ever do, I'll be ready. The tracks were everywhere. They weren't confined to the deck or a single side of the house, but circled it completely, weaving an erratic path between windows and doors. Whoever had made them had taken their time, pausing at each entry point, each pane of glass, as though deciding their next move, or perhaps waiting for mine. My breath clouded the icy air as I followed the prints toward the edge of the woods, the unease in my chest growing heavier with each step. The trees loomed tall and dark, their shadows stretching long over the snow. It was there, at the edge of the tree line, that I noticed something even more chilling. The boot prints didn't end, they merged. The crisp impressions disappeared into the flattened grooves of what could only be tire tracks, the telltale marks of a snowmobile etched faintly into the snow. I crouched down for a closer look, brushing away the light layer of fresh snow that had already begun to settle. The tracks weren't fresh, likely made before dawn, but they were clear enough to tell me one thing: this wasn't random. Someone had planned this, timing their departure perfectly to ensure the falling snow would obscure their trail. My pulse quickened as I stared into the depths of the forest, the faint snowmobile path winding away into the trees. For a moment, I debated whether to follow it, curiosity battling with the instinct to retreat. The tracks were fading fast, the snowfall working tirelessly to erase them, and I knew I wasn't equipped to venture far into the woods. Back at the house, I wasted no time calling the local police. It was almost an hour before the patrol car arrived, 2 officers stepping out into the frigid Alaskan morning. The younger of the 2, probably in his late 20s, looked uncomfortable in the biting cold, while the older man moved with the ease of someone who had weathered many winters like this one. As I recounted the events of the night, their expressions shifted from skepticism to concern. When I mentioned the snowmobile tracks, the younger officer raised an eyebrow. "Could be kids messing around," he suggested with a shrug, but the older man shook his head, his tone grim. "Not a lot of kids out riding in a storm like that," he said, casting a knowing glance at his partner. The 2 men followed the tracks into the woods while I waited by the house, my nerves fraying with every passing minute. When they returned 15 minutes later, the lines on their faces told me everything I needed to know. The trail's almost gone, the older officer said. Too faint to follow now. He hesitated, then added, but this wasn't random. Whoever it was knew exactly what they were doing. The weight of his words settled over me like the heavy snow still blanketing the yard. My mind raced with possibilities. Who could it have been? What did they want? What do you think they were after? I asked, my voice tight with unease. The officer gave a small shrug, his breath fogging the air. Could have been someone looking for shelter, he said, though his tone didn't sound convinced. Or maybe they just wanted to scare you. That last suggestion hit me harder than I expected, the thought of being deliberately targeted sending a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. As the officers drove away, the unease lingered, settling deep in my chest. I couldn't stop picturing the footprints circling my house, the deliberate path of the snowmobile waiting at the forest's edge like a getaway vehicle. Whoever it was, they had stalked me through the storm, knowing full well that I wouldn't venture outside into the blizzard. This wasn't a prank or a desperate act of survival, it was calculated. By mid-afternoon, I knew I couldn't spend another night in the house without taking some kind of action. The vulnerability I felt was unbearable, every creak of the walls and gust of wind feeding my growing paranoia. I grabbed my jacket and headed into town, the drive to the nearest gun store feeling surreal, like I was stepping into someone else's life. I'd never been one for firearms. My life in the woods had always been about embracing the peace and solitude of nature, not preparing for confrontation. But after the events of the previous night, the thought of being unarmed if someone returned wasn't something I could live with. The clerk at the store was a grizzled man with a calm demeanor that seemed unaffected by the storm outside. He listened patiently as I explained what I was looking for, nodding knowingly as though he'd heard similar stories before. I left the store with a 9mm handgun, a hunting rifle, and enough ammunition to feel like I had a fighting chance if things ever escalated. The clerk even took the time to give me a quick crash course on firearm safety and storage, his words practical but firm. Don't go looking for trouble, he said as I gathered my purchases, but make sure you're ready if it finds you. That night felt different. I wasn't just waiting for the next knock or sound outside, I was prepared for it. I installed motion-activated floodlights around the house, checked and rechecked every lock, and placed the handgun on the nightstand within easy reach. The hunting rifle stood ready by the front door, a silent reminder that I wasn't planning to be anyone's easy target. Living in solitude had always been my escape, my sanctuary from the noise and chaos of the world. I loved the stillness of winter storms, the way the snow blanketed the landscape and transformed the woods into a silent, untouched realm. But now, the storm felt like something else entirely, a cover, a shield for anyone who might be lurking just beyond the tree line. The thought was sobering, but it also hardened my resolve. If anyone came back, they wouldn't find me unprepared. Even now, months later, the memory of that night lingers in the back of my mind. Every time the snow begins to fall and the wind picks up, I find myself checking the locks, glancing at the rifle by the door, and wondering if they'll come back. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted, I still don't know. But one thing is certain, if they return, this time, they'll be met with more than just a locked door and a flashlight. Out here in the woods, you learn to protect what's yours, or you let someone take it from you. I've made my choice. The thought of losing what I cherished most, my peace, my solitude, was unbearable, and I resolved to never let fear dictate my life. Still, every time the snow fell, the wind howled, or the woods stood cloaked in winter silence, I found myself gripping the rifle near the door, scanning the horizon as if the storm carried more than just weather. Months later, as I sat in my ice shack on a frozen Minnesota lake, that same sense of unease returned, though this time for a different reason. Fishing on the ice had always been a ritual of solace for me, a way to disconnect from the chaos of everyday life. My father and I had braved countless brutal Minnesota winters together, his old thermos of coffee steaming between us as we waited patiently for the faint tug on the line. Even after he passed, the tradition endured, a way for me to feel close to him. That day was no different. After a grueling week of tight deadlines and endless emails, I packed my gear and headed to the lake, undeterred by the forecast of an incoming blizzard. The ice was thick, solid enough to hold the weight of trucks, let alone my small shack and sled. The storm only sweetened the deal, no crowds, no distractions, just me and the sprawling, snow-covered expanse of the frozen lake. By the time I arrived, visibility had already dropped to 20 feet, the snow falling in dense sheets that the wind hurled across the ice. I hauled my sled out, the bitter cold biting through my gloves, and drilled the holes for fishing. Soon, I was nestled in the warmth of my shack, the soft hum of the propane heater filling the small space. Outside, the storm raged, muffling every sound except for the occasional groan of the ice shifting beneath me. For a while, I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet envelop me like a thick blanket. It was the kind of peace only winter could bring, until it wasn't. About an hour in, something caught my eye through the small frosted window of the shack. Squinting, I could just make out the outline of a figure standing in the distance, shrouded in the swirling snow. The figure didn't move, didn't waver, but stood facing my direction as if observing. At first, I thought it might be another fisherman, though I hadn't seen any vehicles in the lot when I arrived. Maybe he'd come on foot? Perhaps he didn't have a shack and was braving the elements. Yet, there was something about the way he stood there, so still, that made my skin crawl. I turned away, convincing myself I was being irrational. Surely, it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes. But when I glanced back moments later, the figure was gone. My pulse quickened. I tried to shake the unease, telling myself it was nothing, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. The sound of crunching footsteps on the ice shattered the silence 20 minutes later. The steps stopped just outside the shack. My breath hitched as I reached for the zipper, slowly pulling it open just enough to peek outside. There he was, standing only a few feet away, tall and bundled in a heavy coat and hat, his face mostly obscured by a scarf. His breath hung in the air in white puffs as he spoke, his voice deep and deliberate. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his tone carrying a strange weight. "What?" I replied, caught off guard. "The ice," he gestured toward the lake. "It's not safe." I frowned, looking down at the holes I'd drilled. The ice was easily 10 inches thick, more than safe for fishing. "It's solid," I said, my voice firm. "Not today," he replied, the words hanging in the air like a warning. His tone wasn't threatening, but it was unnervingly certain. He wasn't trying to scare me, he was cautioning me. Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the storm within seconds. I stood there, baffled and uneasy, replaying his words in my head. What did he mean, not today? The ice had seemed perfectly fine. Shaking off the encounter, I retreated back into the shack, though I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that his warning had been more than just advice. Then, I heard it, a sharp, echoing crack that sent a jolt of fear through me. I shot to my feet as the ice groaned beneath me, the sound growing louder, more urgent, like a spiderweb of fractures spreading out from beneath my shack. Without a second thought, I grabbed my gear and bolted out into the storm. The snow whipped against my face, the wind nearly knocking me off balance as I sprinted toward solid ground. Behind me, the cracks deepened, their deafening roar echoing across the lake. I didn't stop, didn't look back, even as the ice shifted and tilted beneath my boots. Finally, I reached the shore, collapsing onto solid ground with my chest heaving and legs trembling. Turning back, I watched in horror as my shack sank into the freezing water, one side tipping before being swallowed entirely. The ice that had seemed so sturdy, so reliable, had betrayed me. Yet, as I scanned the lake for any sign of the man who had warned me, I saw nothing, no tracks, no outline, no trace that he had ever been there. The snow was untouched, as though his presence had been erased entirely by the storm. A chill ran through me, this one far colder than the winter air. Who was he? How had he known? And where had he gone? I never found answers to those questions. But that day left me with more than just a story to tell. It was a reminder that the wilderness, as beautiful and peaceful as it might seem, hides its own set of dangers, some of which defy explanation. Whether the man was real or something else entirely, I'll never know. But his warning saved my life, and for that, I'll always be grateful. The storm swallowed my shack, but my focus stayed fixed on the spot where I had last seen the man. The ice and snow stretched endlessly across the lake, unmarred by tracks or signs of anyone's presence. The figure had vanished, leaving no trace, as though the storm had erased him completely. I stood there in the biting wind, scanning the frozen landscape, questions racing through my mind. Who was he? How could he have known the ice was unsafe? And where had he disappeared to? The unsettling encounter played on repeat in my head as I trudged back to my car, still trembling from the close call. When I got home that evening, I couldn't shake the memory. The man's warning echoed louder in my mind than the ice cracking beneath my feet. I shared the experience with a few friends, hoping for some kind of logical explanation. Most shrugged it off as a coincidence, chalking it up to a passing stranger or my imagination heightened by adrenaline. But one buddy, an old-timer who'd fished these lakes his entire life, mentioned local folklore. Some say the spirits of the woods and water warn folks when danger's near, he told me over a beer. Could be true, could be nonsense. But you're here to tell the tale, and that counts for something. I wasn't sure if I believed in spirits or supernatural warnings, but I knew one thing, I wasn't going back to that lake anytime soon. Maybe someday I would, once the unease settled, but for now, I'd stick to more predictable waters. The experience had shaken me in a way I couldn't fully explain, a reminder that nature is as unpredictable as it is beautiful, and sometimes its warnings are not to be ignored. Months later, craving a change of scenery and some quiet, I decided to book a remote cabin on Mount Hood for a long weekend. The noise and chaos of my construction job had been wearing on me, too many power tools, too much chatter, and not enough peace. The idea of a snow-covered cabin with a roaring fire sounded like the perfect antidote. A snowstorm was in the forecast, but that only added to the appeal. I pictured myself tucked away from the world, sipping whiskey by the fire as the snow piled up outside. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the first flakes started to fall. The driveway hadn't been plowed in what looked like weeks, so I had to park down the road and lug my gear through the snow to the cabin. It was just as picturesque as the photos had promised, a small, rustic retreat nestled in the woods, with a view of the mountains partially obscured by the falling snow. The key was in a lockbox by the door, and as I stepped inside, the cold hit me. Though the heating was on, it was barely enough to take the chill out of the air. I dropped my bags in the living room, turned on a few lights, and started a fire in the wood stove to warm the place up. That's when I noticed the first oddity, dirty dishes stacked in the sink. 2 mugs, a plate, and a pan streaked with grease sat there like remnants of someone's recent meal. My first thought was that the cleaning crew had slacked off, maybe unable to reach the cabin due to the snowstorm. Annoying, but not a deal-breaker. I quickly washed the dishes, convincing myself it wasn't worth letting a few leftovers ruin my weekend. But the unease crept in again when I went to unpack in the bedroom. The bed was unmade, the blanket rumpled, and the pillow indented, as though someone had just been lying there. When I pressed my hand to the mattress, it was still warm. My gut churned. Could someone still be here? Hiding somewhere in the cabin? I grabbed the flashlight I'd packed, my heart racing as I swept the cabin from top to bottom. The closets were empty, the attic was undisturbed, and there was no crawl space beneath the cabin. I found nothing out of place beyond those unsettling remnants. Still, I tried to brush it off. Maybe the last guest had left in a hurry, or maybe the rental company had overlooked some details. I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin the weekend. The evening passed without incident. I cooked a simple dinner, poured myself a drink, and sank into the couch by the fire with a book. Outside, the snowstorm intensified, blanketing the woods in white and muffling every sound except the occasional whistle of the wind. For a while, I found myself relaxing, lulled by the warmth and the quiet. Around midnight, the peace was shattered by a faint noise, a creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. I sat up, the sound sending a ripple of tension down my spine. I told myself it was nothing. Old cabins make noise, wood expands and shifts with the weather. But as I strained to listen, the sound didn't come again. Grabbing my flashlight, I did another sweep of the cabin. The locks were secure, the windows untouched, and the snow outside remained undisturbed. My nerves calmed slightly, and I went back to bed, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, the storm had passed. The woods were pristine under a layer of fresh snow, and the sky was a crisp, pale blue. I brewed coffee and stepped out onto the porch to take in the view. That's when I saw them, footprints. They started at the back door, their edges crisp and untouched by the snowfall, and led straight into the woods. My stomach twisted as I set my coffee down and followed the trail around the cabin. The prints were clear, deliberate, heading away from the cabin into the dense trees. It wasn't until I stood there staring into the woods that the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The faint noises I'd heard in the night, the warm bed, the dirty dishes, they weren't remnants left by someone who'd been there before me. They were signs of someone who had been there with me. Someone who had waited until I was asleep to slip out. A chill that had nothing to do with the snow ran through me. I scanned the woods for any sign of movement but saw nothing. The footprints vanished into the trees, leaving me with more questions than answers. Who had been there? How long had they been hiding? And why had they left without doing more? I called the rental company, who were apologetic but unhelpful. "We'll send someone to investigate," they promised, but it felt hollow. By then, I had already decided I wouldn't spend another night in that cabin. I packed my things and left, glancing over my shoulder the entire drive down the mountain. Even now, the memory lingers, a constant reminder that solitude, as beautiful as it is, can also be dangerous. Whether it was a drifter, a squatter, or something more sinister, I'll never know. But the next time I retreat to the woods, I'll be more cautious, because sometimes you're not as alone as you think. As I stared at the snow-covered landscape, the chilling realization sank in. Whoever had been lurking in the cabin had chosen their moment carefully, lying low until I was vulnerable. Those strange noises I dismissed as creaks from the cabin or gusts of wind weren't my imagination. They were footsteps, movements, and the unsettling presence of someone who had been there all along. Feeling both violated and uneasy, I called the rental company to report the incident. The person on the other end of the line was quick to apologize, their tone a mixture of concern and embarrassment. They claimed they had no idea anyone could have been squatting on the property and assured me it was an isolated oversight. They even offered a full refund and suggested I leave immediately for my safety. But I wasn't ready to cut my trip short. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe I just didn't want to be chased out by fear, but I told them I'd stay the final night. After a brief pause, the representative hesitantly shared some advice. The cabin has heavy manual locks on all the doors. They're old, but they're reliable. Lock them all from the inside tonight. Once they're secured, no one can get in from the outside. It wasn't the most reassuring statement, but it was something. Determined to reclaim my peace of mind, I spent the rest of the afternoon double-checking every lock, every window, and every entry point. The age of the cabin, while unsettling earlier, now worked in my favor. The bulky, old-fashioned locks were solid and nearly impossible to tamper with. By the time I finished, the place felt like a fortress. I could still feel the lingering unease, though, like a shadow in the back of my mind, but I pushed it aside. I settled into the evening with a cup of coffee by the fire, hoping the storm outside would drown out the thoughts swirling in my head. The wind howled louder as night fell, rattling the windows and adding to the eerie silence of the cabin. Every snap of a branch or creak of the old wood made me glance at the doors, expecting to see a shadow standing there. My imagination conjured all sorts of scenarios as I listened to the storm rage on. Was the person who had been hiding still nearby? Were they waiting for me to fall asleep again? Or was it just paranoia playing tricks on me? I didn't sleep much that night. Every so often, I'd hear a noise, an unsettling crack of ice outside or the faint thud of something brushing against the cabin. Each time, I froze, my heart racing, but the locks held firm, and the night passed without incident. By morning, the storm had finally cleared, leaving a pristine layer of snow blanketing the world outside. I packed my belongings quickly, eager to leave the cabin and put the unsettling experience behind me. As I loaded my gear into the car, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, scanning the woods for any sign of movement. The air was eerily still, the snow untouched except for a fresh set of footprints leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the forest. My chest tightened as I followed the trail with my eyes, wondering if the person who had been there the night before was watching me even now. I didn't bother calling the rental company again. Their apologies and reassurances wouldn't erase the unease that had settled over me. Driving down the winding, snowy mountain road, I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the distance, watching me leave. The experience left a permanent mark on me. These days, whenever I rent a cabin, I make it a point to inspect every corner before settling in, paying close attention to any sign that someone else might have been there. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that solitude, no matter how peaceful it seems, can sometimes be anything but safe. A few months later, I found myself chasing another quiet escape, this time to photograph the breathtaking landscapes of Taos, New Mexico. March in Taos is a photographer's dream, with snow-dusted peaks and the vast, endless sky creating a striking contrast. A snowstorm was forecasted, but the dramatic weather only heightened my anticipation. I imagined capturing the storm rolling over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the kind of shot that could make any portfolio shine. The roads were already slick as I turned onto a narrow, winding back road that hugged the edge of the mountains. It wasn't part of my original plan, but the view ahead was too tempting to pass up. I knew the risks of veering off my route, but I told myself I'd only go a little further. The snow began to fall harder, the heavy flakes clinging to my windshield faster than my wipers could clear them. As visibility dropped, the road seemed to narrow, with sheer drop-offs on one side and towering evergreens on the other. I debated turning around, but before I could find a spot to safely do so, my tires hit a patch of ice hidden beneath a snowdrift. The car slid sideways, the steering wheel jerking uselessly in my hands. I felt the crunch of snow as the car came to a halt, buried in a drift that swallowed the wheels. Frustration and a twinge of panic settled over me as I tried rocking the car free, spinning the tires, even shoveling with my hands. Nothing worked, the snow held my car firmly in place. With no other options, I climbed back inside, checked my phone, and cursed when I saw there was no signal. I wasn't panicking yet. I had blankets, snacks, and a full tank of gas. Worst case, I'd wait it out until someone came along. About an hour later, the distant glow of headlights cut through the swirling snow behind me. Relief surged as a pickup truck pulled up and stopped a few feet away. The driver's door creaked open, and a man stepped out, bundled in a thick jacket and beanie. "You all right there?" he called, his voice muffled by the wind. I cracked my window, keeping the door locked. "Yeah, I'm stuck," I replied. "Was hoping someone might come by." He nodded, stepping closer, his boots crunching in the snow. "I can give you a ride to town," he offered, his tone casual but tinged with something I couldn't quite place. "It's a ways back, though." "Sure you want to stay out here in this storm?" Something about his demeanor made my gut twist. His words were polite, but his eyes kept drifting to my car, scanning it like he was sizing it up. I shook my head. "Thanks, but I'll wait it out. I've got everything I need." The man hesitated, studying me for a moment. "Storm's getting worse," he said, his voice quieter now, almost coaxing. "Might be all night before anyone else comes by." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, forcing a smile. "I'll be fine." "Thanks, though." For a moment, he didn't move. Then he nodded, a faint smirk curling his lips. "Suit yourself," he muttered, turning to walk back to his truck. But instead of leaving, he circled my car, his hand brushing the hood as he passed. My pulse quickened as I locked the doors, my eyes tracking his every move. Finally, he climbed into his truck and started to reverse, the headlights fading into the storm. My tension eased for a brief second, until I noticed the truck had stopped, idling a few feet behind me. The engine revved occasionally, like the driver was impatient, but he didn't move. Minutes stretched into an hour, the truck's headlights a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. I stayed frozen in my seat, my phone clutched uselessly in my hand, praying he would leave. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, the truck was gone, the storm's eerie silence pressing in around me. When I finally made it back to town, a waitress at a diner paled as I recounted the story. "You're lucky," she said. "There've been reports about a truck like that. The driver targets stranded folks, but no one knows what he wants. Just that it's nothing good." The memory still haunts me. These days, I travel with a satellite phone and a 4x4 equipped for any terrain. But the lessons from that night are etched into my mind. Out in the wilderness, danger can take many forms, and trusting your instincts is the best survival skill you have. I cracked my window just enough to hear him over the howling wind. "Yeah, I'm stuck," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was hoping someone might pass by." He nodded slowly, stepping closer, snow clinging to his jacket and beanie. "I can give you a ride to town," he offered. "It's a bit of a trek, though." You sure you want to stay out here in this weather? His tone wasn't outright threatening, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way he lingered on his words, as though testing my desperation, or the way his eyes flicked to my car, like he was studying it more than me. Thanks, but I'll wait here, I replied, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. The storm will pass soon enough. He stood there, letting the snow pile up on his shoulders, watching me for a beat too long. Storm's only getting worse, he said, his tone dipping slightly. Could be all night before anyone else comes by. I forced a thin smile and repeated, I'll take my chances. He didn't move right away, as though debating something. Finally, he gave a small nod, almost to himself, and muttered, suit yourself. But instead of heading straight back to his truck, he began walking around my car. At first, I thought he was inspecting it, maybe trying to assess if he could tow me out. Then his pace slowed, his hand brushing lightly against the hood, almost like he was marking it. A shiver ran down my spine. I double-checked the locks, my finger hovering over the button just in case. When he completed his slow circle, he stopped near my window and leaned down, his face uncomfortably close to the glass. You sure you don't want to ride? He asked again, his voice quieter now, almost coaxing. I didn't answer. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to meet his eyes. After a long pause, he let out a low chuckle, humorless and unnerving. Then, without another word, he straightened up, walked back to his truck, and climbed inside. Relief began to creep in as I watched his headlights reverse into the storm, but then they stopped. The truck didn't leave. It just sat there a few feet behind me, idling. The engine revved every few minutes, a low, grating sound that sent my nerves into overdrive. I turned off my own headlights, hoping he might think I'd fallen asleep or lost interest in whatever game he was playing. Deep down, though, I knew this wasn't over. Minutes stretched into an hour. My fingers hovered uselessly over my phone, which showed no signal. I considered making a run for it, abandoning my car and trekking down the road, but the thought of leaving the relative safety of the vehicle and facing him out in the open was even more terrifying. So I stayed put, gripping the steering wheel as the truck continued to idle ominously behind me. At some point during the night, I must have drifted off from sheer exhaustion. When I opened my eyes, pale gray light was filtering through the storm, signaling dawn. The truck was gone. I hadn't heard it leave, but the snow behind me was undisturbed, the only proof of its presence the faint imprints of its tires before they vanished into the distance. My body was stiff as I climbed out of the car to check the situation. The snow had eased, and with some effort, I managed to dig my tires out enough to inch my way back onto the road. When I reached town later that morning, I stopped at a diner to warm up and collect myself. As I recounted the night's events to the waitress, her face paled. You're lucky, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. There've been reports about a truck like that. The driver's been stopping stranded folks, trying to get them into his vehicle. No one knows what he's after, but it's nothing good. Her words sent a chill through me, colder than the storm I'd just escaped. What would have happened if I had accepted his offer? Or if I hadn't double-checked my locks? I couldn't bear to think about it. That encounter left a lasting impression. As soon as I got home, I traded in my car for a 4x4 with heavy-duty tires, stocked it with a portable shovel, blankets, and a satellite phone. The thrill of chasing storms and capturing the perfect shot still calls to me, but I've learned to be cautious. Because if that night taught me anything, it's that snowstorms don't just hide natural dangers, they can also cloak the intentions of those who thrive in the shadows. Trusting my instincts saved me, and I'm grateful for that. But the memory lingers, a stark reminder that sometimes, the most chilling part of a storm isn't the cold, it's the people you meet in the midst of it.